Hello and welcome. A few days ago there was a Twitter spat between Jordan Peterson, who has 3.9 million followers, and Pope Francis, who has 18.9 million, if you don't include the 1 million assumed to be Latin Mass supporters who follow him on his Latin account. Now, the news of this may fill you with delight, or perhaps horror, or maybe even a bit of both. After all, the Pope's Twitter account usually contains a collection of short pieties which are intended just to cheer the soul, and they don't tax the mind very much. But on this occasion, Professor Peterson's mind was not cheered. The jury is, of course, still out on his soul. He took issue with the Pope replacing piety with politics. What had the Pope written to provoke the world's most popular psychology professor, and to make him lay down a Twitter challenge? Hashtag social justice, wrote the Pope, demands that we fight against the causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of labour, land and lodging, against those who deny social and labour rights, and against the culture that leads to taking away the dignity of others. Could come straight out of the Communist Manifesto, perhaps. To which Professor Peterson, never short on self-confidence, replied, "There's nothing Christian about hashtag social justice. Redemptive salvation is a matter of the individual soul." Well, not surprisingly, an agnostic professor of psychology lecturing the Pope on his faith produced a tidal wave of social media reaction. Those commentators who haven't got much interest in the Pope from day to day, but who do carry a great deal of animus towards Jordan Peterson, mocked him mercilessly for what they assumed to be hubris. After all, how dare an agnostic pop psych professor tell the Pope he's got the faith wrong? A tweeter called George summed it up for the anti-Peterson brigade. He tweeted in confident riposte, "I don't know what's funnier, you trying to lecture the Pope on what Christianity really is, or that you're loudly proclaiming that acting like Jesus is wrong." Scoffing broke out all over, and the Twitter mob was very much with George. But if we take George at his word and we look back at the actions and the priorities of Jesus himself, the founder of Christianity, there's prima facie evidence that Jesus was neither a socialist nor even much of a social justice warrior. In Matthew 26, when Jesus observes, "You will always have the poor with you," it doesn't really lend itself as a slogan for social reform. And his words in Matthew 25, "Insofar as you did this for the least of these my brethren, you did it unto me," were taken by the early church to refer to the homelessness, imprisonment, poverty, and of solidarity with persecuted Christians suffering for their discipleship, rather than a motto encouraging the formation of a second-century socialist league. But beyond swapping Bible verses, is there any other evidence that the Pope's endorsement of political movements that tilt against poverty, inequality, and try to support labour rights is problematic for Christianity? Well, although Peterson isn't yet a Christian, it looks increasingly like his rosary-praying wife is beginning to practice Catholicism. So it might have been Tammy that pointed out to him some of the Pope Francis's predecessors, who passionately denounced socialism as being completely incompatible with Catholicism. Despite the present Pope's political preferences, the historic papal mind is not at all well disposed towards left-wing utopianism. And so why not? Well, in his encyclical Humanum Genus in 1884, Pope Leo XIII warned that socialism was planning the deliberate overthrow of the Church. He turned out to be right. Sir Pius X, who died in 1914, foresaw the dystopias that socialism would cause wherever it would impose, as he wrote, "But stranger still, alarming and sudden and saddening at the same time, are the audacity and frivolity of men who call themselves Catholics and dream of reshaping society under such conditions, and of establishing on earth and over and beyond the pale of the Catholic Church this reign of love and justice. What do they think they're going to produce? Well, they produced what Mao and Stalin produced, of course. Pope Pius, who died in 1939, pointed towards the conceptual contradictions that the premise of socialism were based on. He wrote, "Socialism, if it remains truly socialism, even after it has yielded to truth and justice on the points which we've mentioned, can't be reconciled with the teachings of the Catholic Church, because its concept, both of humanity and society itself, is utterly foreign to Christian truth." And indeed, socialist governments have relentlessly pursued policies that undermined the concept of family, whilst the left-leaning state invariably has growing ambitions to replace not only the presence of God for the human heart, but also the family, whilst pursuing policies that undermine both traditional roles of motherhood and fatherhood, and fail to protect the children in the family. On the other hand, of course, Catholic social teaching does have a long and intense history of interaction with the body politic and giving expression to a variety of different ways to give some political and social leverage to the injunction to love our neighbour, but everything is in the balance. Why should Peterson bother to go head-to-head with the Pope over social justice of all things? Well, although he's been accused by the left of representing the alt-right, the left always accuses its critics of being right-wing, he's been careful to explain in public that the left and right politically need each other in a mature body politic, because the right has a duty to conserve what needs conserving and the left to reform what needs reforming. And these aren't the observations of a partisan political Nazi. He's been as excoriating with criticising the dangers of an unrestrained right as he has been that of the left. But if we can remember that Peterson was propelled into the public square by his resistance to the ambitions of the new left, which were, after all, to impose trans pronouns and criminalise free speech in Canada. And whereas in the second half of the 20th century, when Pope Francis's generation were caught up in a competition with the left to express the love of the neighbour and took political routes to do it, the totalitarian regimes the left had created were largely hidden behind iron and bamboo curtains. The quest for equality had in fact created the lethal ruthlessness of what Solzhenitsyn described in the Gulag Archipelago, and caused 90 million casualties in Mao's Cultural Revolution. But none of this impinged on the freedom of the West's speech and action. The West really didn't seem to notice much. And Peterson has railed against the ignorance of history that seduces the idealistic young with promises of social justice, without their grasping that coercion always removes free thought, free speech, and free action, as the history of the 20th century shows. But the main thrust of his critique of social justice has been to reinforce what the present Pope's predecessors saw so clearly, which is that the aims of the left are in fact undeliverable and diverge from the priorities of the Church at the most critical points. For example, equality always sounds deeply desirable, but Peterson reminds us that the Pareto curve demonstrates that despite Marx's idealism, equal effort and equal distribution are unachievable. The popular desire for equality of opportunity is never the same as the left's determination to achieve equality of outcome by force when necessary. Critics laughed at Peterson's lobsters, but his point was rather more serious. Hierarchies, embodied in the most ancient of biological structures, look unattractive, but they deliver competence quite as much as they offer status. And without competence, we have no defence left against anarchy. Compelled speech and restrictions on what can be said prevent individuals from discovering what we believe as we frame our experimental thoughts with words. Peterson insists, and rightly, that we need the freedom to experiment with words without being silenced by a thought crime imposed as hate speech, and no one needs freedom of speech more than the Church on fire with evangelization. But perhaps the most serious point of divergence between Peterson and the present Pope was Peterson's reminder that Jesus' priorities were expressed in terms of salvation of the soul in the face of our impending judgment, and not the redistribution of wealth, opportunity, and the outlawing of slavery throughout the Roman Empire. And in case we should mistake the rights of the body for the preeminence of the needs of the soul, St. Luke reminds his Gentile listeners that when you come across the word poor in Hebrew thought, it's almost always shorthand for the poor in spirit. One of the greatest theological errors of the last century was the seduction of liberation theology, an intellectual experiment driven preeminently by the Jesuits. Perhaps Peterson's Twitter intervention with Pope Francis represents a reminder to the more elderly hierarchy of the Church that a program of social justice seldom comes free from a totalitarian price tag. When attacked or questioned by journalists for his worldwide influence, Peterson points to the transformation of motive, outlook, and performance that his analysis has produced, which also represents a form of social renewal, but one that begins with the renewal of the mind. It would be a strange thing if he didn't try to remind the Church that if real personal and societal renewal can be ignited by a refreshed mind, it might be even more inspired by a renewed soul. God's people have often had to rely on eccentric sources to rediscover God's better way when they got lost. If Balaam could take advice from an opinionated ass, perhaps a pope can be helpfully informed by a loquacious pop psychologist. Well, we can but pray.